Mr. Howard Clement has been a Durham City Councilman for 30 years. He has made extraordinary contributions to the community, and he has devoted his life to making Durham the city it is today. 50 years ago, during the summer of 1963, Councilman Clement witnessed history in the making. He was on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., when Martin Luther King Jr. brought the plight of Black Americans to the public consciousness. Today, we are going to relive the history of Councilman Clement's experiences on the day that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the speech that transformed a nation, "I Have a Dream." Councilman Clement, can you please describe for us the events of that day?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I recall vividly the events of 50 years ago, August 28th, 1963, when nearly 1 million people gathered in Washington, D.C., near the Lincoln Memorial, to hear and see one of the great historic events of our time. The March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech, are highlights that I will always recall as long as I live. Yes, August 28, 1963 was a great day in the history, not only of America, but of the world.
What exactly was your involvement? Can you describe where you were, what you saw, what you heard?
It was my privilege to serve as one of the, and I don't want to glamorize it, but at least I was asked to serve as the chair of the North Carolina section of the March on Washington. Several buses gathered in Washington the morning of August the 28th. And of course, Durham was well represented. We had close to 3 to 4 bus loads of citizens from the Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill area to gather at the St. Joseph's AME Church at the time to go to Washington that morning. And it was a glorious morning. 50 years ago seems like it was a long time ago, but I can recall vividly what happened that day because it made such quite an impression on me, not only on me, but on my soul and on my consciousness. And I'm just so glad that I had the opportunity to participate in what I think was one of the epic, historic days, not only of the world, not only the United States, but of the world. And the fact that after 50 years, the presence of August the 28th remains vivid in my mind shows how historic, how epic-making, and how transformational that day was. And again, I was glad to be there.
How close were you to King when he delivered the speech?
There were 7 individuals between my person and Dr. King when he made that I Have a Dream speech. People wondered how I was able to get as close as I did. Well, I just for the sake of history, my father had always taught me that when you want to go someplace where there's a big crowd, just keep moving. And I just kept moving until I got to the point where I needed to be on the morning of August the 28th. 7 persons were between Dr. King and me when he gave that I Have a Dream speech.
Seven degrees of separation couldn't be more true. When you wake up the morning after a speech like that, the day after, how do you feel and what do you do?
Well, I began to reflect on the significance of that day during the bus ride back to Durham, so much so that when I got home in Durham, my wife at the time, she greeted me when I got back. In fact, I couldn't go to sleep that morning, thinking about the events of August the 28th. And even though 50 years have passed, I still say that the memories of that day still remains vivid in my consciousness. And the first thing I did of any significance, in my opinion, was to sit down and dictate a letter to Mr. Asa T. Spaulding, Sr., who was my boss, who was the president of North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company at the time. I wrote him a letter asking, in effect, why didn't you and other company officials participate in the March on Washington? It just so happened that Dolores Clement, my wife, was Mr. Spaulding's secretary. And of course she saw the letter, and she of course questioned my judgment in writing that kind of letter to the man who signs my paycheck. But I felt very strongly about it. As I told Mr. Spaulding, and I'm repeating, that if and when black folks were emancipated and were given, and we'd already earned the right, we just never got the right to participate fully in this great democracy. I said, when that day happens and black folks do arrive, so to speak, North Carolina Mutual, along with other black entrepreneurs, will be the first to try to take advantage of that occasion. And so in that light, I urge you to pass that letter on. While I appreciate your willingness to be a censor, that's not your role in this connection. So she very hesitatingly passed the letter on to Mr. Spaulding. And of course, as you can imagine, all hell broke loose. But I don't regret having done what I did, and I'll do it all over again because it lightened Mr. Spaulding's consciousness, because he kept telling me over the years that I've been there at North Carolina Mutual, and this was my third year of employment, that we are in the insurance business, not in the civil rights business. But while I agreed with him on part that we are in the insurance business, I also felt that we had a right and a privilege to participate in civil rights phenomenon, particularly since, in my view, we were going to be a prime beneficiary of what I call the next emancipation of black America. The Emancipation Proclamation, which is 150 years old this year, 2013, while that proclaimed our rights, it depended on companies like North Carolina Mutual and other black entrepreneurs to take advantage of the opportunities that those rights promulgated. And so, and here 50 years later, I see it happening. More and more black people, black businesses are becoming more involved with the economic, entrepreneurial interests of this great country.
Relative to your experiences as a Durham City Councilman for the past 30 years, what are some of the most important lessons that you have learned?
Well, yes, Durham's come a long way. When I came to Durham in February of 1961, I think, if I recall, the population, based on the census at that time, we were 70,000 people. Today we are close to 230,000, 50 years later. And so many changes, positive changes, have taken place during the past 50 years. And for me to have the opportunity to be a participant as a city councilman in some of these changes demonstrates to me how transformational the March on Washington really meant to this great city. I can talk about the ballpark. I can talk about downtown Durham. I can talk about what's happening in East Durham with the revival of the black community there in terms of its economic and recreational growth. Well, I can go on and talk about it for a long time of what has happened in this town in the last 50 years. And in due in my opinion, to the convergence of the total community to finally decide we're going to work together rather than work against each other. There was a time when blacks were for blacks and whites were for whites, and the growing Hispanic population was coming into its own. But we finally decided that if we were going to make progress, economic, religious, social, recreation, educational, we had to do it together. And of course, during this time, we had leaders like Bill Bell, Nick Tennyson, and others of their ilk who decided to put race behind them and decide we're going to work together. And the whole community has profited as a result. But again, I don't want to lose sight of what August the 28th, 1963 meant to this community. It was the catalyst, in my opinion, to what has happened 50 years later.
Looking back on your tenure, what was the happiest moment and what was the saddest?
Well, certainly the happiest moment was when, in my view, when the schools were merged. And under the leadership of Bill Bell, our current mayor, the schools, the Durham City schools and the Durham County schools became one entity. And that was a great moment in the history. And, of course, things are keeping evolving to a greater truth. Now, to sad moment. Well, April the 4th, 1968 was a sad moment, not only for me, but for the whole world, in my view, was when Martin Luther King was killed in Memphis, Tennessee. That was a sad moment. And, of course, while Durham didn't react like other cities, Detroit, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, I think Baltimore, we had our moments. I recall vividly being called to what is now North Carolina Central University by the students there to come down and help control what some feared to be a riot growing out of the assassination of Dr. King. Fortunately, we were able to get to Central and channel the students' energies into a march on downtown Durham. There we met with the police and other and official members of what I call Durham's leadership to help stem the growing anger in Durham over the death of Dr. King. That was a sad moment, but it served as a catalyst for what followed. And of course, what followed was greater interaction between the black and white communities, how we can work together. If my memory serves me correctly, the mayor at that time was Grabaric. And while he certainly was not a flaming liberal, he wasn't even a lukewarm liberal. But the fact he was politic enough to know what he had to do, and he brought us in to sit down and talk about what the city needs to do to channel the anger that had been generated in the black community because of the death of Dr. King.
And now, more recently, you've been back at least one more time to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and that would be 4 years ago for the first inauguration of Barack Obama.
Yes, that was, and still is. Of course, that will never change. I mean, the election and subsequent inauguration of the first African American to be president of these United States. It was my privilege to be there at that occasion. It was a cold morning, but it was a beautiful morning. I had never seen so many people gathered in one spot in my life. And my wife, Ann, accompanied me for that occasion. And while I'm not speaking for her, but she has reminded me how grateful it was for her. She is to have had the opportunity to go to the inauguration of the first African American president in the United States, and of course that event has been strengthened because of his re-election. And if I may comment on that, a lot of people said that Obama won the first election in 2008 because people wanted to be a part of history in electing the first black president. But when he was re-elected, that shows to me that it wasn't his first election was not a fluke, and in fact it was easier for him to get re-elected than it was for him to be elected. And so my only regret, and I have to put this in my statement, is that my parents, and especially my father, was not here personally to witness the election of and subsequent inauguration of the first African American as president of these United States. He had fought so long, and I follow in his fact. I'm standing on his shoulders. He fought so long to secure these rights for all people, but especially for the African American.
How would you like to be remembered?
Well, I'm really not that interested in what I'm remembering. The fact that I've been on the council for nearly 30 years is in my opinion, noteworthy in itself. But that's just for me and my family to cherish. But the fact that this community gave me an opportunity to serve in this capacity for 30 years is all, in my view, is historic, because it's the first time anybody has served as a member of the city council for as long as I have. And I'm grateful that the people of Durham have given me the opportunity to serve in this capacity as a member of the city council. Because I'm always reminded, I think it was Thomas Jefferson who said, he who governs closest governs best. And those of us who serve at the local level, as a city councilman or as a county commissioner, we have a lot to be grateful for, that we had the opportunity to be among those who, like Thomas Jefferson said, he who serves closest serves best.
Mr. Clement, it was an honor to record our conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I appreciate y'all asking me to be a part of this process.